Good evening. I'm Bishop Dr. Edward Donalson III, the Provost Fellow of Ecumenical Relations here at the Center for Ecumenical and Interreligious Engagement of Seattle University. Before I share my thoughts that will hopefully ground our discussion tonight, I would like to take a moment to thank Dr. Michael Reed Trice, our Executive Director, John Malcolmson, our Center Coordinator, and the entire Center staff, who I'll thank more later, for all of the work and support that has gone into making this learning community possible. The Center seeks to continually uplift the highest moral values of all wisdom traditions. Socio-political realities of our times have caused many to question the validity of voices in organized religion and church culture. With this series, our team seeks to intentionally center voices that have been impacted by the marginalization of imperialist, capitalist, anti-Black, cis-hetero patriarchy, and all systems of oppression that work to create and support the carceral state. The task of theology is to revise and critique religious language and praxis, interrogating where we uphold our highest moral standards and how we live those moral standards out in community. Tonight, as a learning community, we seek to engage both head and heart toward healthy habits of inclusion and flourishing. Without question, the United States of America is addicted to violence. From the inception of our identity as a nation state, the narrative of our nation is written in blood. We have no national identity without theft, violence, and human rights violations of the most egregious nature. The national addiction is particular to white violence in service of dominator culture. Just see the Boston Tea Party. America is not necessarily a welcoming place for all bodies. In particular, it is violent and unwelcoming to Black bodies. The racialized capitalist project of the United States has commodified the existence of Black bodies through the African Holocaust of enslavement to Americanized apartheid, better known as Jim and Jane Crow, lynching and government-sanctioned murder known as police brutality. The insatiable desire for enormous profits, coupled with sadistic brutalization of any bodies considered other, are the foundations of our imperialist, anti-Black, capitalist, cis-hetero patriarchy. All of this, in some perverse way, has been rooted in a theologic which supports the mythology of white supremacy. When speaking of whiteness in this context, it is not a skin color, because the parameters of whiteness change. Historically, whiteness is then the social construct of power and domination rooted in anti-Blackness that serves to disinherit and marginalize those considered radically other. Race is not a concrete or static reality, but an imaginative construct created in particular times and places by specific influences and impacts. Whiteness is the cultural obfuscation of what it means for Black people to reflect the image of God, because it impairs our ability to self-love and to love others. Racial exclusion was designed to protect the elite cis-hetero patriarchy of native-born whites. In the racial logic of the nation states, immigrants and other non-white bodies were racialized as the antithesis of cis-hetero patriarchal ideas. Race as an American institution is an invitation to power and privilege, or excommunication and exclusion from that same power and privilege. The construct of race is built to identify proximity to power. As ethnicity and social construction were invented, racial exclusion and other ethnic assimilation provided the genealogical context for sociology's inscriptions of race and sexuality as socially constructed. Whiteness is a broad term used to cover an even more pervasive and ubiquitous reality of the divide between majoritarian and the minoritarian. The minoritarian subject in Western, specifically for our purposes, American culture, is always defined in relationship to the majoritarian public sphere. The public sphere, in this sense, is one that privileges whiteness, the masculine, the native-born, and the heterosexual. Minoritarian being is, in this sense, defined by a set of relations and proximities to the major. Minoritarian is then shorthand to describe a communism of incommensurability made up of often fractious and inconsumable, but no less necessary alliances forged between people of color, especially women, queer people, trans people of color. Minoritarian then describes less an identity than a commons marked by the exigencies of social identity indifference. Majority is assumed when a particular class, the bourgeois, white people, colonists, heterosexuals, men, cisgendered people, assumes the position of a universal metric or constant. Majority implies a constant of expression or content, serving as a standard measure by which to evaluate it. But majoritarian being also implies a privileged relationship to power, often resulting in domination of descendant or minor classes, the proletariat, people of color, indigenous people, queer people, women, trans people, whose deviation from the constant paradoxically confirms the norms, borders, and boundaries by which the ascent or major class is defined. Majority assumes a state of power and domination, not the other way around. White Christian nationalism is one of the greatest majoritarian projects of social construction, and its power is at full thrust currently. From book banning to attacks on reproductive justice and transphobic laws, the white nationalist agenda is the total erasure of whole peoples. The impulse to make whiteness and conservative Christianity the foundation and guideposts of American governance and culture means that all people deemed outside the normative standard of white male, able-bodied, wealthy manhood are relegated to what Frantz Fanon named a zone of non-being. As the legal and juridical foundation of this nation state never considered those outside of those parameters to be seen as fully human. And what advances have been made through legal action are currently being threatened and overturned also through legal action. The religio-political marriage of the conservative politics and evangelical fundamentalism from the time of J. Edgar Hoover and Billy Graham has set the stage for an alliance bent on creating a social order that disinherits anyone who is outside the boundaries of dominator culture. Christian nationalism is not a creed, but in my view, it's a political ideology. It promotes the myth that the American Republic was founded as a Christian nation. It asserts that legitimate government rests not on the consent of the governed, but on adherence to the doctrines of a specific religious, ethnic, and cultural heritage. It demands that our laws be based not on reasoned deliberation of our democratic institutions, but on particular idiosyncratic interpretations of the Bible. The conversation we engage tonight seeks to help us unpack the realities of this dangerous theopolitical movement and to give us tools to begin the work of dismantling its grip on our nation. I'd like to introduce you now to tonight's panelists, Reverend Dr. Troy Carr and Reverend Dr. Rick Rouse. Reverend Dr. Troy Carr is an elder in the Pacific Northwest Conference of the United Methodist Church. She serves as the chair of the Ethnic Ministries Commission for the PNWC, and for the past year, she worked with the General Commission on Religion and Race for the Global United Methodist Church in Washington, D.C. Dr. Carr also worked as an anti-racism research consultant with the PNWC Innovation Team. On July 1st, 2023, Dr. Carr will make history as the first woman and person of color appointed to pastor Gresham First United Methodist Church in Gresham, Oregon. Welcome home, Dr. Carr. Dr. Carr earned her BS in social work from Roberts Wesleyan College, which is now university, Rochester, New York. Her Master's of Divinity is from Gettysburg Theological Seminary United in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And she is a double alumna of Seattle University, receiving her DMin in 2020 and a Master's of Nonprofit Leadership in 2022. I would ask that you would join me in welcoming my friend, the Reverend Dr. Troy Lynn Carr. Our other panelist is the Reverend Dr. Rick Rouse. He is a pastor in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. He has served as a parish pastor and a seminary professor. He is a certified spiritual director and parish consultant, and the author of 5 books, including The World is About to Turn, Mending a Nation's Broken Faith. Tonight, we will begin with a presentation by the Reverend Dr. Rick Rouse. Welcome him with me.
Greetings all. It's good to be with you tonight, and thank you so much, Doctor, for your gracious invitation. Tonight's presentation, The Narrative of the Lie, White Christian Nationalism and Rage. You may have heard of the Reawaken America roadshow that was organized by Michael Flynn, former national security advisor and leader in the Christian nationalist movement, that has also included other notables such as Roger Stone and Jared Kushner. A crowd of 3,000 gathered in Batavia, New York last October for one such rally. "We're under warfare," one speaker said. Another said she would take a bullet for my nation. And a third insisted they hate you because they hate Jesus. Attendees were told how now is the time to put on the whole armor of God. And Flynn then invited people to be baptized. Scores of people gathered around 3 large tubs filled with water. While praise music played in the background, pastors lowered them under the surface, welcoming them into their movement in the name of Jesus Christ. Flynn warned the crowd that they were in the midst of a spiritual warfare and a political war. Musician Sean Fucht made this declaration on Palm Sunday as he stood on the steps of the Missouri Capitol. "Together as the Church of Jesus Christ of Missouri, we're going to take communion right here. We're going to win this war with communion because the blood of Jesus is our greatest weapon. I'm being obedient to the Lord and taking communion to all 50 states. The blood of Jesus is strong enough to cover every problem that plagues this nation." Co-sponsored by Turning Point USA, this Christian nationalist tour is headed to state capitals to claim territory for God. Like Reawaken America, it utilizes sacred Christian traditions in a quest for political power. In addition to communion, the rally included worship rituals like prayer, praise songs, and an altar call. Reaching a fever pitch, we prayed, "Go with us, God, as we go to the next state capital, and over the next 2 years, God will follow us in a cloud of glory." Michael Flynn made headlines by calling for the establishment of one religion in the United States. Flynn told a crowd in San Antonio, "One nation under God and one religion under God, that is Christianity." Simply put, Christianity should be at the center of American life and institutions. Attendees were told that it's under attack and they need to fight to restore our nation's Christian roots. Like Flynn, many Christian nationalists long for a theocracy when their brand of Christianity can be the official religion of the land. The screen now shows a group of pastors that are warning people about the fallacy of this Christian nationalist ideology. And according to Michael Curry, presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, it's an ideology clothed in religious language and religious symbolism that has become a political strategy. Known for her support of conspiracy theories, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Congresswoman from Georgia, and many of her colleagues express Christian nationalist views that erode democracy and violate fundamental constitutional principles of religious liberty in America. While Christian nationalism becomes a cultural framework that blurs the distinctions between Christian identity and American identity, viewing the two as closely related and necessary to preserve the Union, it's a message that upends our constitutional ideal of a pluralistic and multiracial democracy. Columnist Jennifer Rubin suggests that Christian nationalists harbor a set of extreme beliefs at odds with our history and our pluralistic democracy. She reports that while most Americans embrace pluralism, 30%, mostly white evangelical Protestants and Republicans, remain animated by this vision of a white Christian America. She cites the Public Religion Research Institute and Brookings Nationalist Survey, indicating that Christian nationalists believe the US government should declare America as a Christian nation. US laws should be based on Christian values. If we move away from our Christian foundations, we won't have a country anymore. Being Christian is an important part of being truly American. God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. Think about that. And what does that mean for us? What is so alarming is that Christian nationalist values are becoming ingrained in mainstream culture. This new Christian nationalism survey makes it clear that there is an underlying ideology of racism among the Christian nationalist movement that connects with white nationalist groups who rely on old and new tropes to promote white supremacy. Americans who are supportive of Christian nationalism generally hold less favorable views of immigrants, racial and ethnic minorities, and are less likely to believe that racism remains a problem in the American society. 65% of Christian nationalists disagree that white supremacy is still a major problem in the United States today. 75% believe in the replacement theory, the view that people of color are replacing white cultural and ethnic roles. Here's my outline as we seek to understand why Christian nationalism is such a threat to democracy and the Judeo-Christian witness. We'll unpack the myth of American exceptionalism, uncover the real history of the great American experiment, learn about America's founders and their religious ideals, explore the marriage of the political right and the religious right, explain who are the Christian nationalists and what they believe, expose the violence associated with this movement and why it is a major concern to people of color, recognize the danger it poses to our school children, and consider what we can do as people of faith to heal the divide. Christian nationalism has been present in some form or another throughout our nation's history. Its origins begin with the myth of American exceptionalism, the belief that America was God's chosen nation. And because of that, our destiny with greatness was both ordained and secure. The myth was perpetuated by religious and political leaders in the English colonies in North America. The doctrine of discovery, first issued by Pope Nicholas V in 1452, gave European explorers the right to claim and exploit any land not inhabited by Christians. This gave credence to America's sense of manifest destiny. And you can see here what Pope Nicholas in his papal bull outlined: to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue. It has provided the rationale for the genocide of 90% of Native American population, which shrunk from 12 million before the Europeans arrived to only 248,000 by 1890. From 12 million to 248,000. As well as given credence to slavery of non-white persons on whose back this nation was built. It was taught that the Anglo-white race was superior and intended to be God's instrument of salvation for all others. In his book, Christianity Corrupted: The Scandal of White Supremacy, Dr. Jermaine Marshall recounts how the founders of America were European colonists who equated whiteness with perfection. This initial basis for white supremacy and white privilege was the result of racial classifications of the 17th century that considered white Europeans as culturally and racially superior. Race was a political concept, not a biological one, constructed to keep all other races subjected to one race through oppression. Marshall goes on to suggest that the real scandal of this theory of race was that its roots were to be found in Puritanism and in Anglicanism. These Christian faith traditions became a major catalyst for white superiority and white privilege in the American colonies. The myth of American exceptionalism has come to include a revisionist version of history of our nation's founding, claiming that the Declaration of Independence and Constitution were based on Christian principles. The myth goes on to conclude that America is favored by the Christian God who has always been on our side. We have much to repent for regarding our nation's past. It is the denial that we are a racist culture that has been founded on the premise of white privilege and white supremacy, and how this has led to the suffering, division, hate, prejudice, and injustice on so many levels. Congresswoman Lauren Boebert of Colorado might struggle to pass a high school civics class. At a rally last summer, she proclaimed, "The church is supposed to direct the government. The government is not supposed to direct the church. That is how our founding fathers intended it." Her statement represents a subversive interpretation of America's founding principles. Boebert made it clear that she was tired of this separation of church and state junk that is not in the Constitution. Well, Christian nationalism is based on the myth that the American Republic was founded as a Christian nation. It asserts that the legitimate government rests on adherence to the doctrines of a specific religious, ethnic, and cultural heritage. In other words, fundamentalist white Christianity, one that looks back on a fictionalized history of America's alleged Christian founding. A stunning 90% of Christian nationalists think that God intended America to be the new promised land where white European Christians could create a society that could be an example to the rest of the world. The problem is the founders never intended to establish the United States as a predominantly Christian nation. In fact, coming from Europe, where state religion was common, and particularly in England, where the king was head of the church, they did not want religion to interfere with or influence their newly formed democratic government. Andrew Siddell, in his book, The Founding Myth, Why Christian Nationalism is Un-American, suggests there are two facts to dispute their claim. Fact one, religion is absent from our constitutional identity. Fact two, God is not responsible for America. That honor belongs to the founders who had no common faith among them. We need to understand what they were thinking when our nation was created. Consider the fact that American colonists came from Europe, where the church dominated politics. Consider the fact that for centuries, the Pope was seen as more powerful than kings and even the Holy Roman Emperor. By contrast, the nation's founders wanted to ensure a separation of the two and avoid early American experiments such as the Puritan rule in Salem, Massachusetts, home of the famous witchcraft trial. And did you know that in 1659, the Puritans made it illegal to celebrate Christmas in the colony? They felt that due to the holiday's pagan origins, celebrating it would constitute idolatry. At that time, a small minority forced its religious views on the majority population. Well, consider what is happening today. The courts have allowed employers to withhold medical benefits such as contraception from their employees if it violates their religious views. Businesses such as florists and bakers can discriminate against LGBTQ plus individuals if it offends their religious sensibilities. State legislatures are limiting or banning abortion, making anyone assisting held criminally liable. Idaho is one of 14 states that have made it a crime for a parent to get gender-affirming care for their transgender child. This is what happens when religious liberty is misconstrued as an individual's right to impose their values on others rather than to respect differences of our religious practice. It appears the founders sought to erect a wall of separation between religion and government, the government they created. Our Constitution is deliberately godless in that there are no references to gods or goddesses or divine intervention. Supernatural power is rejected in favor of natural power contained in the words, "we the people." The Constitution's only references to religion are exclusionary. It excludes the state from involving the state in religion and excludes religion from involving itself in the state. We read, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion." The idea of a government separate from religion comes from the Enlightenment's period with the teachings of such people as John Locke, Voltaire, and others. It was the great American experiment establishing a truly secular government. No other nation had sought to protect the ability of its citizens to think freely by separating government from religion and religion from government. America was the first to try this. The founders recognized that religion can be exploited for political gain, and that religion, when it has civil power, can be deadly. So let's explore what some of the founders actually had to say about this. George Washington thought religion was best left to the private sphere, for it was a personal matter. He stated, "No one will be more zealous than myself to establish effectual barriers against the horrors of spiritual tyranny." Thomas Jefferson agreed, suggesting the legislature make no law respecting the establishment of religion, nor prohibiting the free exercise of religion. He is the author of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which was the model of the First Amendment. The law ensured no government support of religion. The government couldn't take away a person's rights because of their religion. And finally, religious tests for public office were prohibited. James Madison argued that the separation existed as much to protect religion as to protect the government. For Madison, the tendency of government and religion to mix and corrupt each other was so great a danger that it could not be too carefully guarded against. He said, "State and church will exist in greater purity the less they are mixed together." He voiced opposition to establishing Anglicanism as the state church of Virginia and was a zealous guardian of religious liberty. And finally, Ben Franklin vigorously supported the rights of religious freedom, speech, and assembly. And he said, "What one believes about God is not as important as living a life of love." The concept of Christian nationalism gained steam in modern times with the marriage of the fundamentalist-leaning churches and the political right. President Jimmy Carter had been favored by the evangelicals because of his Baptist faith, and he received their overwhelming support in the election of 1976. The political strategists for Ronald Reagan saw an opportunity to extract that support by using the wedge issue of abortion. It wasn't that the politicians cared much about abortion at that time, but they believed it could be a swing issue and would swing the election in their favor. It was only one of a number of factors, but it marked the beginning of the Republican Party's embrace of conservative Christian values. Following Reagan's election, Billy Graham was interviewed by Parade magazine and offered this cautionary note. It would disturb me if there was a wedding between the religious fundamentalists and the political right. The hard right has no interest in religion except to manipulate it. To better understand who are today's Christian nationalists, let's look again at the recent survey on Christian nationalism. First, the good news. 29% of Americans reject Christian nationalism outright, and 39% are skeptical of it. However, the survey also found that 65% of white evangelical Protestants are either adherents or sympathizers, and more than half, or 55%, of Republicans are as well. It's important to note that 90% of Christian nationalists endorse the idea of an authoritarian leader, one who is willing to break some rules to set things right. They are threatened by the growing secularization of America and the perceived loss of Christian values. Not only do they pine for a strong leader who will save America for God, but growing numbers suggest that a theocracy would be preferable to our form of democracy. What is causing so much concern among white Christian nationalists that they are pushing this idea that there is a battle underway for the soul of America? There are actually two major factors, both of them demographic, that are seen as threats to a privileged status. First, the fact that within the next 10 to 15 years, white Americans will no longer make up the majority of people in this country. This is happening through immigration and interracial marriage and conception. Talk show hosts are using conspiracy theories that play on people's fears about this. For example, I mentioned earlier the Great Replacement theory that believes that liberal elites are deliberately replacing white citizens with people of color. Not only will white people lose their position of privilege in our society, the conspiracy suggests it will eventually result in the extinction of the white race and the fall of Western civilization. Second, the census of American religion that tracks trends in respect to religious affiliation in the United States shows white Christianity has been in long decline from 72% in 1990 to 42% in 2020 and 2021. And Pew Research suggests that as early as 2030, Christians may be in the minority in this country. Robert P. Jones, in his book, The End of White Christian America, writes about the decline of white Christians, saying, the continued demographic decline makes it clear the MAGA goal of reestablishing their vision of a white Christian America, which cannot be realized by democratic means. And last month, Dr. Trish Harrison Warren wrote about the global transformation of Christianity, writing that Christianity is exploding in the Southern Hemisphere, and with the United States home to more immigrants than any other country in the world, the future of American Christianity is neither white evangelicalism nor white progressivism. The future of American Christianity is probably not one where white concerns and voices dominate the conversation. The future of American Christianity now appears to be a multi-ethnic community that is largely led by immigrants or children of immigrants. In their book, Taking America Back for God, researchers Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry reveal some interesting data. They find that a sizable portion of Americans pine for Christianity's former prominence in American civic life and feel their faith threatened or marginalized. They fear their values will no longer be dominant and their freedom to preach their moral values and share their religion could be outlawed. The reaction has been one of fear turning to one of rage. There has been an alarming increase in extremism and violence in this country, as we know. Again, the PRRI Brookings Christian Nationalism Survey found that while only 16% of Americans agree, 60% of Christian nationalists agree with the statement, because things have gotten so far off track, true American patriots have to resort to violence in order to save our country. 60% agree with that statement. The study found that supporters of Christian nationalism overwhelmingly agreed with the arguments that are fueling racially motivated attacks at places of worship across the US, especially synagogues, mosques, and Black churches. Daniel Boas writes for the Religious News Service that in the past 10 years alone, North America has seen white supremacists carry out mass shootings at multiple religious sites. She cites a recent FBI report published by the International Commission to Combat Religious Racism that found that the perpetrators of these attacks were nearly all white males, and many were part of larger conspiracies tied to white supremacy ideology. Nearly 2/3 of the cases involved a series of attacks, multiple perpetrators, and/or affiliation with an extremist group. We can see that hate crime is at a new decade high. Furthermore, the survey suggests that Christian nationalists want to use violence to intimidate Black communities and other communities of color, similar to tactics used during the Jim Crow era, which was prior to the Civil Rights Act of the 60s. The FBI reports that hate crimes are at a record high, and the Southern Poverty Law Center has tracked over 800 hate groups across the United States. While a growing number of Americans seem willing to accept violence as a means of political expression, communities of color and religious minorities are increasingly vulnerable. The 2022 midterm voter election poll conducted by the African American Research Collaborative found that of all the issues, Black respondents were most concerned about the rise of white nationalism. 73% were worried about extreme Republicans and white nationalists promoting hate towards immigrants and minorities. To people of color, it appears white supremacy is alive and well and is using violence and intimidation to shape a conservative political agenda. Whitehead and Perry reveal these findings from their research. One, those who embrace Christian nationalism are less likely to believe in the importance of social and economic justice. Two, they tend to be mistrustful toward those who do not meet the membership requirements of the native born, which is Christian and white, namely racial minorities, non-white immigrants, and Muslims don't pass the test. Three, they believe that whites are as likely as African Americans to be abused by the police. Four, the society they wish to live in is a society in which families are traditional and men and women are in their proper roles. And five, Americans who embrace Christian nationalism are more likely to exclude non-Christians from full inclusion in American civic life. Christian nationalism is a threat, again, to this pluralistic, democratic society. Supreme Court Justice Harry Blackmun once remarked, "A government cannot be premised on the belief that all persons are created equal when it asserts that God prefers some over others." Christian nationalist ideology is focused on gaining and maintaining access to power. It seeks to ensure that one particular group with a specific vision for the country enjoys privileged access to the halls of power and has the ability to shape our culture into its own image. It fuses national and religious symbols and identifies its own desires as legitimate. There is no room for disagreement. It demands complete allegiance and even worship. Sin at its basic root is placing our trust in that which is not God. Christian nationalism, as we've heard, is an ideology that functions similar to a religion in that it requires people to trust or believe in an idea. Those who adhere to the ideology are considered righteous. Those who don't are unrighteous. And this ideology, in fact, replaces faith or trust in God. Christian nationalism does not seek to add another voice to America's pluralistic democracy, but rather to replace our foundational democratic principles and institutions with a state grounded on a particular version of Christianity. It's not just a culture war, it is a political war over the future of our democracy. White Christian nationalism is a threat to the children of America. Ever since the civil rights legislation of the 60s, there has been a white flight from public schools to private schools or homeschooling. And most of the leaders of the homeschooling movement are white evangelicals who embrace Christian nationalism and are teaching a revisionist history, including the myth that America was founded as a Christian nation and is favored by God. Project Blitz is the name of a conservative movement espousing Christian nationalism in public schools with the stated purpose, quote, to protect the free exercise of traditional Judaic Christian religious values and beliefs in the public square, especially public education, unquote. They wish to create a system where Christians receive a privileged place in government and our school systems. They have been lobbying state legislatures and promoting model legislation for public education. And their proposals include the following. Already passed by the state of Oklahoma is an elective on Bible literacy. Their rationale is that youth need God's word in order to survive and thrive in a non or anti-Christian culture. Second, passed by a dozen states, is the requiring posting of a banner stating "In God We Trust." In some states, it's not just in every school, but in every classroom. And three, Mississippi is among states that wish to promote school prayer in the classroom, and they have passed a law with a trigger clause that should the Supreme Court allow prayer in school, it will now be then required in their classrooms. The message being sent to our children is that if you're not a Christian, you are not a full American and may not be welcome in your school. Moms for Liberty is another national organization advocating for parents' rights. And recently, House Republicans passed a Parents' Bill of Rights. The phrase parents' rights has become a term of choice for a conservative effort to ban books, censor school curricula, and suppress politically undesirable knowledge from the classroom. Florida is one of 18 states that has passed legislation restricting how teachers can discuss racism and sexism in school. And states like Florida have likewise empowered parents to remove any books, films, or classroom material that might make their children uncomfortable. To date, around 2,571 titles have been targeted, compared with only 223 in 2020. Let me read that again. In 2020, 223 titles were targeted. This year, 2,571 titles have been targeted. Governor DeSantis recently ordered his state's education commission to expand the Don't Say Gay bill to include all grades K through 12, bans instruction or even conversation around matters of sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity. Christiane Gunn, a social studies teacher in Broward County, Florida, worries about her ability to support students' mental health, saying, "This is a blow to young people. Kids come to school with a lot of baggage. what's going to happen to the social, emotional wellness of our children if we can't talk about real life issues. The reality of parents' rights movement is that it's meant to empower a conservative and reactionary minority of parents to dictate education and curricula to the rest of the community. Columnist Jamie Bowie writes, "It's a Trojan horse for a relentless effort to dismantle a pillar of American society. It's not about parents at all. It's about whether this country will continue to strive for a more equitable and democratic system of education, or let a reactionary minority drag us as far from that goal as possible." Those embracing this post-liberal order have turned to so-called cultural wars, as we have seen. They want a strong government to enforce their religious values on American society and reject those of both parties who support democratic norms they see as destructive. Christopher Rufer was appointed by Governor DeSantis to the board of New College as part of a mission to turn a progressive school into a right-wing bastion. Ruffo stated their chilling intention, quote, "We are going to see conservative state legislators reconquer public institutions all over the United States," unquote. To view our cultural history in this way is to engage in a triumphalist retelling of the story of a dominant culture that marries a particular religion to the politics of the nation state. History demonstrates that the fruits of Christian nationalism, whether in Nazi Germany or America today, are often horrific, descending into harsh rhetoric and violent means to retain power. Catherine Stewart, in her book Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism, writes, "America's Christian nationalist movement has been misunderstood and understated. The religious right has become more focused and more powerful, even as it has become less representative of the nation's populace. It's not a social or cultural movement. It is a political movement, and its ultimate goal is power." So what have we learned? First, so much for revisionist history that claims those colonial leaders sought to inject their religious principles into our nation's founding documents. Christian nationalism is a pathology rooted in America's past. The biggest fraud is that the United States was founded as a Christian nation and that God favors America above every other nation. The wall of separation between church and state is not a latter-day fiction concocted by secular liberals, as Christian nationalists would have us believe. It is a principle written into our history as a core achievement of the American Revolution. We need to reclaim the genuine religious freedom that our founders established and most of our citizens still cherish. Second, white Christian nationalism seeks to merge Christian American and American identities, claiming that you can't be a patriotic American unless you're a devout conservative Christian. It's a toxic ideology that demands Christianity be privileged by the state, enables white supremacy, and is an affront to both the gospel and the Constitution. This movement is a distortion of Christianity whose goal is to make religion and right-wing politics inseparable. Amanda Taylor, executive director of the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, warns, Christian nationalism undermines and attacks the foundational values in American democracy, and that is the promise of religious freedom for all. Third, we must confront the rising ideology that is rooted in America's original sin, the sin of white supremacy. The old ideology is undergirded by an old heresy with a new name, white Christian nationalism. A couple of weeks ago, Justin J. Pearson, along with state representatives Justin Jones and Gloria Johnson, the Tennessee Three, staged a rally at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, where white supremacist James Earl Ray assassinated Reverend Dr. King on April 4th, 1968. Pearson stated, We who were elected to represent all Tennesseans, Black, white, brown, immigrant, female, male, poor, young, transgender, and queer, are routinely silenced when we try to speak on their behalf. Republican-led state houses across the country are proposing and passing staggering numbers of bills that serve a fringe white evangelical agenda that abrogates the rights and freedoms of the rest of us. We have a nation in pain and in peril. ELCA pastor Lenny Duncan, author of Dear Church, writes, "White supremacy is a systemic force in this world that defies God. I believe the only hope for mainline Christianity is to dismantle white supremacy, first in our pews and then in our communities. This is the call of discipleship. With the rise of xenophobia, racial violence, and nationalism in the United States, it's hard to deny the roots of real hurt that people of color experience in this system. White supremacy," he says, "is antithetical to the gospel." Finally, in rejecting Christian nationalism, we are in fact preserving religious liberty for all of the citizens in this country, whatever their beliefs. While some fear we are losing a Christian foundation, we must remember we were founded on a pluralistic nation where all religious ideas were to be valued and protected. So, how do we deal with those who espouse Christian nationalism? A dramatic transformation would likely need to happen for this movement to return to pluralistic politics. Jennifer Rubin suggests the MAGA crowd would have to recognize America's complete history, reflecting our full experience, not just a story of people like them. And most important, they would need to rediscover the principles on which the United States was founded, that all are created equal. And they would have to abandon the myth that America is the domain of one race and religion. I think there are several things we can do as individuals and together. First, we need to remember the words of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. And so we must share openly and boldly our concern about this dangerous movement with friends, neighbors, family. In doing so, it is important that we approach others in a spirit of care and concern, not just one of confrontation. It's good for us to model respectful, civil conversation that requires we listen as well as we seek to educate. There is a wonderful resource available to us, Christians Against Christian Nationalism. You can go to the website, christiansagainstchristiannationalism.org, where you'll find a number of webinars, resource materials, and other things that will be helpful in sharing with your friends and neighbors this important work of countering Christian nationalism. Second, we need our schools to teach democracy as a part of a robust course of civics. This would be a nonpartisan course where the central ideas of American democracy are taught, individual rights and liberties, equality, justice, the rule of law, as well as checks and balances in government. We also need to teach an American history that has not been whitewashed. Students need to know the whole truth about our history, the good and the bad. To accomplish this, we need brave educators and open-minded parents. And of course, we need to teach critical thinking. And third, we should reject the notion that in order to be truly American, one must be Christian, and in order to be truly Christian, one must be an American. White Christian nationalism means that there's only one way. White Christian nationalists are promoting an us versus them attitude by planting fear of the racial other and asserting that white Christians must take back America for God by whatever means necessary. Michael Curry, again, the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, reminds us If you exclude people, it is not Christian. Christianity is following Jesus in a way of love, not some ideology that promotes fear and hatred for others. Finally, it's important to remember that our unity is not dependent upon uniformity, that is, marching in lockstep to the same drum. We are people of diverse opinions related to politics, religion, and life. For nearly 200 years, the official motto of the United States was E pluribus unum, out of many, one. It was a reminder that America's strength is not derived from assimilating uniformity, but instead from the richness of authentic expressions of diversity. We need to celebrate that diversity, remembering that what unites us as Americans is not our theology, our morality, or the color of our skin, but rather our shared belief in the dignity of every human being, as expressed in the Declaration of Independence and in Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. We must reclaim the dream of a nation that believes in liberty and justice for all people.
Thank you so much for such a thoughtful and engaging presentation. We have just, our minds and our hearts have been fed equally. Thank you so much. At this time, it's my privilege and my honor to welcome to the microphone the one and only Reverend Dr. Troy Lynn Carr.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Donalson. Thank you, Dr. Ross. When Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a student at Morehouse College, he wrote an article in the college newspaper, The Maroon, titled Purpose of Education. And there is a popular quote from the article that says, "The function of education is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically." Dr. Ross, tonight your presentation has accomplished both of those principles for me. So thank you for such an informative and pragmatic lecture. With that being said, I heard in your presentation two terms. One was Christian nationalism. And you defined Christian nationalism several ways. You said Christian nationalism is an ideology that functions similar to a religion and that it requires people to trust or believe in an idea. Earlier in your presentation, you also mentioned that Christian nationalism is also embedded in a misnomer about America, or in the ideology of exceptionalism, that this country was founded on Christian principles. Then you defined white Christian nationalism. And in defining it, you alluded to that term being embedded in this pseudo ideology of supremacy, white supremacy. So for me, the overarching hermeneutic that I heard in the presentation, I do need some clarity. The hermeneutic that I heard conflated in a way Christian nationalism and white Christian nationalism. It sounded like those terms can be used interchangeably instead of intersectionally. Though you do at one point out that Christian nationalism does intersect with white Christian nationalism. Could you please, for me, clarify, are those two separate terms, or are they interchangeable? or should they be teased out? Could you please differentiate and clarify those terms for me before I move on with my final response?
I'm assuming you want me to answer that at this moment. And I would say that they are interchangeable. I don't think that there's a difference really between white Christian nationalism and just Christian nationalism. And as I said earlier, it is a form of white supremacy. There's no question.
Thank you very much for clarifying that more for me. That wasn't quite the way that I fully understood it. White Christian nationalism is embedded in this pseudo understanding of there's a supreme culture or a supreme ethnic group, which is this European or Anglo white group of people. And then Christian nationalism itself are these persons that believe that this country was founded on some type of Christian principles. And it's not necessarily a category that is just for one ethnic group. But thank you for clarifying that for me, that Christian nationalism and white Christian nationalism is the same thing. And I wanted that clarification because you mentioned dismantling or decolonizing decolonizing Christianity in a way when you were towards the end of your conversation, and even in your book, The World is About to Turn, you do talk about in chapter 7, the 10 ways to move forward. And then you begin to talk about this decolonization work that needs to be done. So those who are conveners of groups of faith, or those who are pastors or practitioners, would need to understand all of these decolonization principles. And for me to be able to go in and do those types of, have those type of conversations and do that type of work, especially talking about this topic, this very hot topic, Christian nationalism and white Christian nationalism, it is very important for me to first have everybody own their own social location, and not group all people into one pool. In the book, it talks about the importance of diversity and recognizing diversity. In the presentation, it talked about the future of the church being multi-ethnic, and for us to be able to have a place where harm or injury doesn't happen to any population or any demographic. It is so important that we own our stuff. And it is important for me that white people own their own social locations, understand them, and then own the stuff that belongs to them uniquely. But anyway, I just think for those of us who are conveners of faith groups or pastors of congregations, that the work is all divine, and there's a lot of work to do. I was also wondering, as a convener yourself, an educator, I know that you are a retired active pastor, but you're still leading and teaching within your own faith group. I'm just wondering, what tools would you offer us, and what tools do you have for us that would be leading these congregations or convening in those spaces? What would you suggest that we do first?
I'd be happy to give you an example. In fact, there is a program actually that was designed by the Episcopal Church that is called Sacred Ground, and it's for people to come together to look at videos and read articles and books, books like White Fragility and others that get at the heart of what racism is all about in this country. I mean, that's one tool. In fact, we're going to be starting a small group in our congregation, probably, a group of maybe 12 people that are going to be looking at our own racist history, as well as the racial history of this country, and how we can be agents of change in our own communities. So that's one piece. I mentioned the other resource, Christians Against Christian Nationalism.org, that provides resources for congregations, pastors, practitioners, to get a better handle on what this white Christian nationalism is all about and why it is a danger to our witness as well as to our democracy. So those are two resources that I'm currently utilizing in my work.
Thank you very much for that answer. Dr. Ross, I was reading a poll by Pew Studies, some statistics, and as an African American and owning my own social location, I was very interested in what they had to say about what's our response to Christian nationalism and what does it mean to be an African American person, and how do we believe? And one of the things that it showed is that 97% of African Americans do believe in some type of higher divine person or do believe in God. And then about 3/4 of those persons believe in the God that is ascribed to them through the Holy Scriptures, whether it be the Christian Bible or the Quran. And then there's a even smaller percentage of those persons that tend to lean towards a very conservative way of being, which could fall into that evangelical Christian nationalism category. That's why I needed the clarity about these terms that we are using, because the work is so complex and the web is so tight when pulling it apart. A lot of it, I know Raboteau and Henry Louis Gates in their writings, Raboteau in his Slave Religion and Henry Louis Gates in his History of the Black Church, they would talk about these the Black church as an institution and all of the different things that it provided outside of just worship, that it also was a place where we were educated about a plethora of ideas. And I know for myself that even within the context of the community, there are some people who see themselves as conservative, but not as a Christian nationalist. They may believe in some of the ideology that this nation, is a Christian nation, and that prayer should have its place in education. Not really thinking very diverse in that space. And I'm not just talking about African Americans, I'm talking about other people of color too, with a higher percentage of those people being people of an Asian descent or background. So I needed to understand those concepts that felt very conflated to me, to be able to tease them apart, because a lot of that also comes from the assimilation and the history and the beginnings of these churches. One of the things that I found very intriguing in reading the book that you wrote, The World is About to Turn, is that in that book, I did see from Dr. Marty some information about the Puritan movement in the colony in the beginning. But what I didn't see was the history, especially the history of chattel slavery and all of those things. Because if we're going to point to, in the presentation, if we're going to point to the original sin of America, then we have to be very honest and transparent. And that takes vulnerability too, to name the original sin, because it becomes very vague to just say original sin. It can mean different things, especially with white people when talking about that. So I'm just wondering, for the convener or for the pastor, it sounds like some partnerships with civic teachers and historians need to happen. And how do you, I know you mentioned Sacred Ground, which I'm very familiar with, and actually had the opportunity to meet the person that created that whole program in my time here in DC. But that's a really good conversation starter and a really good program to help white people talk about racism. But I'm just wondering, for you and your teachings, other than those type of tools, is it a space, or does it burn the bridge? Do you become a martyr and burn the bridge when saying to white Christian nationalists that this history lesson is essential and significant to beginning this decolonization process?
I think that's why it's important to educate. I mean, to just kind of take the veil away, this myth, just to kind of tear it apart and say, this is something that is being perpetuated and being taught that is not true, or it's being whitewashed, so that we're not telling the total truth. That's why I talk about the fact that our children need to be taught the full history of American life and our past, not just one that makes them comfortable and proud to be an American. We have a lot of things to repent for, as you know, in this country. And it's not to say that everything about America is bad, but it's to say, let's take an honest look at who we are, where we've come from, what is going on right now. Let's not be afraid to talk about who we are and what challenges we face today. It's again, it's about being honest and truthful.
Thank you both so much. And thank you, Dr. Carr, for such a thoughtful response and such thought-provoking questions. It's wonderful to be in a learning community where we can query together these various topics and hopefully provide for our community a way forward to open this conversation. We were made aware during the presentation that fairly recently, the spelling of the Yakama tribe has reversed to its original spelling of Yakama. And so we just wanted to lift that up in case there was any inadvertent offense. We are used to, in the Pacific Northwest, spelling it in a very particular way. So we just wanted to acknowledge that while we're all together. Well, I would just absolutely positively love to hear from Dr. Carr, perhaps her closing thought, her final statement, what it is she really wants to leave us with tonight.
Thank you, Dr. Donaldson, for that invitation to have a closing thought. And thank you for touching on decolonizing wealth, which is something that gets me very excited. Just having different disciplines, I am very intentional to try and stay on the lane that I was invited to for that day, and not integrate everything all the time, because everything gets me all excited. But thank you for talking about that piece, which is very crucial, because here's the thing, and it's so true. When we think about chattel slavery and we think about slavery in America, we immediately know that it was a dominant culture that enslaved the African people that came over and eventually outnumbered them. But initially, they were the dominant culture as far as numbers. But when you think about South African apartheid, there was a minority culture that did the same thing, oppressed and enslaved these African people that outnumbered them. And the reason they were able to do it is because of wealth. They may have been small in numbers, but they were strong in money and power, and money is power. So thank you. That just got me all stirred up. I don't know if that's my final thought, but thank you for being on that side of the river and lifting that. It is important, because one of the things in a lot of the narratives about who African Americans are in this present culture really does deal with a lot of negative misnomers and myths about who we are as a people, that's grounded into what happened when they demonized who we were as humans, that we were beastly, and that our brains were not, the same, that it was inferior. And all of these dangerous words about inferior ways of being also then became part of myths and lies about us being trustworthy, our hard workers. Most people that I know that are people of color are very hardworking people. They have gigs, they have jobs, they're overeducated, but yet underemployed. And that's just a common narrative. So that myth and that narrative that was created has to be deconstructed, has to be torn down. And I truly believe that that's the work, the brave work that has to be done by white people. And before we can even get to the part of the river that you came in from, Dr. Donalson, that work has to be done. And stop rebranding white supremacy and giving all of these different names to that particular practice. This racism is so violent, and it injures and it harms so many people. Not just African Americans, but it harms the majority of the beloved body. So I pray that we who are doing this sacred work, us theologians, us conveners, us pastors, us chaplains, whichever tribe we have ascribed to be able to do the sacred work of making disciples, Christian disciples, because that's important to many of our narratives, and I will own that it is important to my narrative. But as we do that sacred work, that we do it in a way that is honest, brave, transparent, and I extend grace to say, and don't personalize it in such a way that you allow it to bring shame and guilt and pain into the narrative, but that you embrace it all, swallow that pill, and prove that God's love is able to conquer all. So again, Dr. Donalson, you mentioned if you hate yourself, how you're going to love somebody else. I will just go ahead on and expose something about me, that I don't look at a lot of TV. And just recently I started looking at something called the RuPaul Drag Race. And what hooked me was the message at the end. If you don't love yourself, how can we do the Great Commission? How can we go out and spread the message? So self-love is important. I just pray people learn to love themselves so that we can begin this very sacred and very essential work of decolonization and removing the veils and tearing down any barriers that do not allow us to journey with each other with equity, with peace, and with love. Thank you very much for inviting me tonight.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Reverend Dr. Troy Lynn Carr. And I will say that we are just thrilled to have you back in the Pacific Northwest. DC has had you for a season, but it is wonderful to know that you'll be just down the road in Gresham, and we have a lot of work to do. Reverend Dr. Rick Rouse, would you give us your parting thoughts, your final words for today?
Thank you, Dr. Donalson. And again, I echo your words of appreciation to Dr. Carr for her presentation and participation tonight. I have a couple of things I'd like to share in closing. First of all, I was at a webinar not long ago of an African-American scholar, and she talked about the real issue for white people in terms of racism is that we look through a white lens at life. That's part of the barrier for us to really understand and recognize what the real issues and challenges are for people of color in this country. We are always looking through a white lens, and she has, she kind of planted in this the idea of how do we begin looking at life with a multicolored lens, not a white lens, but a multicolored lens. So it's how we look at life. It's, I think whatever the issue is, that all of us need to think about, what lens are we looking through? Is it a white lens? Is it a Lutheran lens, a Catholic lens, a Methodist lens? What's the lens that we are looking at life through? Or maybe it's a particular political lens. So I think to be honest with ourselves, to be self-aware of what lens are we looking at life through. And then secondly, it's important for us to recognize, again, the importance of the diversity that is the gift of this country, the gift of diversity both in terms of ethnicity and in terms of religion, that it makes this country what it is or what it could be. The future is not based on one individual or one group's vision of what can be, but what is the vision of all of us together, that recognizing the gift of diversity, the gift of possibility. The words from Micah echo in my ears that I wrote about in our book. What does the Lord require of us, of all of us, regardless of our faith tradition, of our ethnic background? What does the Lord require of us but to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with each other and with our God? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rick Rouse. It's just been a joy to plan this time together and to get to know you better, and the wonderful work you're doing in the ELCA here in the Pacific Northwest. Looking forward to much work ahead. I'd like to close by reminding us just for a moment, as we consider white Christian nationalism, I'd like to remind us of Jesus, the person of Jesus, this Palestinian Jew born under Roman occupation. I'd like to remind us that enfleshment happened in brown bodies. I'd like to remind us that Jesus was born on the underside of power and privilege, that his message was anti-empire, that his message was already decolonized, that he went about providing for those who had no food and healing, leading us to a place and space of universal health care. I'd like to remind us that this Jesus is always challenging empire, always juxtaposed to capitalist pursuits. That this Jesus that we claim unites us in the faith stands diametrically opposed to all that is white evangelical nationalism. And so from that place, may we go and continue together to find the path of Jesus. I'd like to thank you all for attending tonight. I saw in the list of attendees so many of you from Freedom Assemblies Worldwide and from our other ecumenical partners that work with us here at the center. I'd love to say a great big thank you to all of you who have gathered. I'd like to say a very, very special thank you to everyone that made this happen. I'd like to say a special thank you to our audio visual team that did an outstanding job, to Zach and to all of you whose hands were in the marketing, the advertising. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Good night and God bless.